Hey guys, welcome back into the Is AI Coming for Your Job podcast, the podcast where we discuss all things AI as it relates to work and life. I am your host, Jack Forrester. Before we get started, you can send your comments or questions to aiandyourjob@gmail.com. Let me know what you do for work and how susceptible you think your job is to being augmented or replaced by AI. Also, please subscribe and rate the show on whatever platform you're using to listen. Let's get into some headlines. Our first headline is from Forbes, quote, telecom giant BT will cut 55,000 jobs by 2030 and replace thousands of roles with AI, end quote. BT is a British telecom company, and during its latest quarterly earnings call announced that it plans to cut those 55,000 jobs by 2030. Perhaps those folks being laid off can take IBM's courses to ensure they have the skills of tomorrow. 55,000 jobs represent almost 40% of the company total of 130,000. The CEO said that only about 10,000 jobs are expected to be replaced by AI, only 10,000. He went on to say that the company expects to automate most of its customer service and network management roles, saying the company will benefit greatly from AI. And not to stop at 10,000 positions, he said generative AI is a huge leap forward, and he thinks the company can go further with its automation efforts. Our second headline is from the New York Times, quote, The Optimist's Guide to Artificial Intelligence and Work, end quote. Not much of a headline, but this article reads much like you might think it would, but there are some good quotes here to take in. A professor at Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI states that, quote, everybody I talk to, super smart people, doctors, lawyers, CEOs, other economists, your brain just goes first to, oh, how can generative AI replace this thing that humans are doing? End quote. He's right. That's the response I've seen, especially from those with no interaction with generative AI. He goes on to say essentially that this is the type of technology which will allow for new things to be done, but it's hard to imagine what those things are at this point. The article goes on to say that AI can complement human labor rather than replace it. Citing a study, the aforementioned professor outlined the use of AI at a particular call center. They found that the use of the tool boosted productivity by 14%. Customer satisfaction and employee turnover also improved as a result of the tool. The article also cites the implementation of ATMs, or automatic teller machines, and the concern was then that implementation of ATMs would displace bank tellers, and that never came to be. This discussion on ATMs and bank tellers is a fairly common thread in this circle of folks talking about AI and the future of work. It's used to downplay the potential of AI and displacement of workers. There's one additional point from the article I think that bears mentioning. An economics professor at MIT stated concerning the new jobs that will be created as a result of AI that, quote, there's no guarantee that workers will be qualified for new jobs or that they'll be good jobs, end quote. So that's something to think about, too. It's hard to even imagine the type of jobs that will be created or that AI researchers and developers promise. But who's to say they're going to be good jobs? And of those jobs created, there's going to have to be a mass retraining effort for whatever those jobs may be, not to mention the training that will be required from white collar to blue collar, jumping into those trades. Our third headline is from The Atlantic, quote, the first year of AI college ends in ruin. There's an arms race on campus and professors are losing, end quote. So ChatGPT really made one of its biggest splashes when it was introduced back in late November in both high schools and colleges across the country. I distinctly remember a niece of mine telling me just before Christmas that friends in her high school were using ChatGPT to write papers. Apparently that trend has continued. Use of ChatGPT is raising major concerns and questions about ownership across education, and it will soon across every other sector of life. If I create or prompt an AI photo, do I own it? even though that photo was the aggregation of millions of already existing photos on the internet. Remember that these large language models pull all of their data from the internet. So these technologies have studied millions, if not billions, of pictures online. So when you prompt an AI to create a picture of two gladiators fighting, that's created based off all of the inputs that system was exposed to. So who owns it? The same can be said for videos and music. And these same questions apply to education. If you have to write a 1,000-word paper on the Franco-Prussian War and you prompt ChatGPT to write a 1,000-word summary on the Franco-Prussian War, and ChatGPT can absolutely do so, then I think it's safe to say that the paper you turn in is not your own. There's been a struggle with this very thing. Students across the country have been having ChatGPT write papers in seconds rather than putting in the time to do so. This has prompted yet another form of AI to be created. Technologies are now being created and implemented by educators to try and detect if AI was used to write that paper. This battle will continue to be fought, and finding the line on what's too much AI in academic work will have to be settled somewhere along the way. So I guess there's a larger conversation to be had here on education in general, and we'll have that in later episodes. And like I've said previously, I think these technologies are already upending our current educational system, and some college majors are already all but obsolete due to these advancements. Our next headline is from the New York Times, quote, "An AI-generated spoof rattles the markets," end quote. On May 22nd, an image began circulating on social media that showed black smoke billowing from what appeared to be a government building near the Pentagon. As a result, the market started to dip. The picture was quickly dismissed as a fake or AI generated, and the market eventually corrected itself. So here's one of our major concerns. And Bloomberg reported that this may have been the first time an AI generated image moved markets. It will probably not be the last time. You could classify this as a deep fake or misinformation. In either case, it's not difficult to see how severe the consequences could be if regulation isn't implemented to stop this sort of behavior. While I worry about foreign entities trying to sabotage the U.S. with a similar method, I'm also worried about the teenager who thinks it's funny to create images like this, not realizing the potential consequences of such actions. Our next headline is from NBC News, quote, "From brainwaves, this AI can sketch what you're picturing," end quote. So this is as frightening as it sounds. Though it's in its infancy, researchers have been able to decode human brain scans to tell what a person is picturing in their mind. Researchers utilize a type of MRI machine and have participants view more than 1,000 pictures to study the associated brain signals. Those signals were then sent through an AI model to train it to associate certain brain patterns with certain images. From the article, quote, "The results are startling and dreamlike. An image of a house and driveway result in a similar colored amalgam of a bedroom and living room. An ornate stone shower to a study participant generated images of a similar tower with windows situated at unreal angles. A bear became a strange, shaggy, dog-like creature. The resulting generated image matched the attributes and semantic meaning of the original image roughly 84% of the time," end quote. Researchers think that this technology will be in use in the medical fields within the next decade as, quote, "It might be able to help disabled patients to recover what they see and what they think," end quote. It will take 1 or 2 decades more to reach commercial use. A professor at Duke University who specializes in law and ethics and new technologies stated that, quote, "This is a very thin line between what could be empowering and what could be oppressive," end quote. She's worried that AI brain decoding could lead to companies commodifying the information or governments abusing it, and describe brain sensing products already on the market or just about to reach it that might bring about a world in which we are not just sharing our brain readings but judged for them. The professor stated that this is a world in which not just your brain activity is being collected from your brain state, but from your attention to focus is also being monitored. but people would be hired and fired and promoted based on what their brain metrics show. Similar technologies are already going widespread, and we need governments and rights in place now before it becomes something that's truly part of everyone's everyday lives. I couldn't agree more with the professor. Outside of Terminator-type robots or mass disinformation creating global panic, this is towards the top of my list as most frightening technologies in development. It's hard to think about things like this and not immediately think of George Orwell's novel 1984. How can anything but a dystopic future come from this type of technology? It's hard to even imagine how it would be properly regulated. Speaking of 1984, if you haven't read it recently, now would be a good time to go back and read it. The professor also stated that your brain activity could be collected and it could track your focus. I remember reading that Facebook's metaverse would track and record your gaze or whatever you looked at or lingered on while you were in the metaverse. I'm not even sure if the metaverse is still in development, but apparently there's value in learning what people spend time thinking about and looking at. Hopefully this technology is decades away, and if it's not, hopefully it's regulated like the nuclear industry, because it's not difficult to imagine the horrors that could come from such a technology. Our next headline is from Reuters. Quote, Elon Musk's Neuralink says it has FDA approval for study of brain implants in humans, end quote. So we talked about this company, Neuralink, a couple times on the show so far. Neuralink is being developed and funded in hopes of curing neurological diseases, paralysis, obesity, and a host of other things. And this does represent a major milestone for the company. And maybe one day in the near future, we could see lives improve because of it. You may question who would even be willing to subject themselves to such a technology for testing. I have no doubt that there are those suffering among us with no other possible alternatives who will jump at the chance with such a technology. And it's not without precedent. I mean, we do put pacemakers, hearing aids into our body. So there is some precedent for integrating the body with technology, though it's safe to say that inserting that into your brain is a leap from where we're at now. It's difficult not to view this type of technology in a negative or dystopic way, but hopefully this technology is benevolent as we hope it will be. Our next headline is from the New York Times. Quote, brain implants allow paralyzed man to walk using his thoughts, end quote. In a new study, researchers describe a device that connects the intentions of a paralyzed patient to his physical movements. Swedish man, Gert Jan Askum, was injured in a motorcycle accident in 2011 and was paralyzed from the hips down. In a study published on the 24th of May, researchers in Switzerland described implants that provided a, quote, digital bridge between Mr. Askum's brain and his spinal cord, bypassing injured sections. He's been able to stand, walk, and ascend a steep ramp with the use of only a walker. Researchers say, quote, we've captured the thoughts of Gert Jan and translated these thoughts into a stimulation of the spinal cord to reestablish voluntary movement, end quote. In the reference study, the researchers took advantage of an AI thought decoder to read Mr. Oscom's intentions, detectable as electrical signals in his brain, and match them to muscle movements. I'll let you draw the parallels between this headline and the ones we've already discussed. Neuroscientist Andrew Jackson at Newcastle University stated, quote, it raises interesting questions about autonomy and the source of commands. You're continuing to blur the philosophical boundary between what's the brain and what's the technology, end quote. And while that's an important question from the professor, I would venture to say that Gert Jan Askum, the paralyzed gentleman, doesn't care about the ethics of the technology. He can walk again and has his freedom back to an extent. Our next headline is from the New York Times. Quote, AI poses risk of extinction, industry leaders warn, end quote. So AI leaders from around the globe published another statement or open letter citing risk from AI. This particular statement is one sentence and reads as follows, quote, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks, such as pandemics and nuclear war, end quote. That's it. That's the statement. It was signed by over 350 AI researchers, engineers, and executives. I think the brevity of the statement packs a punch. If you're comparing AI to nuclear war or pandemics, I think it comes across as a different animal altogether. And if it's not obvious from the statement, they're ultimately saying that if AI isn't handled properly, it could very well end humanity. This is the more terrifying aspect of AI and something I generally stay away from, but theoretically it takes a whole lot to get AI right, and it takes very little to get it wrong. I'm not certain if we'll get to listener questions this week, but one question that has popped up in different forms is how could AI go wrong? So let's address that here, and probably the most popular example comes from Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom is or was a philosophy professor at Oxford, and he also is the director of the Future of Humanity Institute, and he wrote a book called Superintelligence back in 2014 to warn against the risk of AGI. It's generally thought to be a landmark in AI thought and strategy, and I'll link to it in the show notes. He later put forth the theory or thought experiment, commonly referred to as the paperclip maximizer. It goes like this, quote, suppose we have an AI whose only goal is to make as many paperclips as possible. The AI will realize quickly that it would be much better if there were no humans because humans might decide to switch it off. Because if humans do so, there would be fewer paperclips. Also, human bodies contain a lot of atoms that could be made into paperclips. The future that the AI would be trying to gear towards would be one in which there were a lot of paperclips, but not humans, end quote. Well, that's frightening. To think about humanity being killed or wiped out so the AI could harvest the atoms within our bodies to make more paperclips is something to think about. I'm hopeful that the paperclip maximizer doesn't come for us, but hopefully this open letter will help expedite efforts to regulate AI and will also help align efforts between various AI labs across the world. Our next headline is from Business Insider. Quote, Air Force Colonel backtracks over his warning about how AI could go rogue and kill its human operators, end quote. So earlier this week, a story was circulating heavily that in an Air Force AI simulation, the AI-assisted drone tried to kill the drone operator. That story has since been walked back by the colonel in the Air Force. The initial story said that, quote, it killed the operator because that person was keeping it from accomplishing its objective, end quote. So think about the paperclip maximizer. But the official later said he misspoke, and the Air Force clarified that it was a hypothetical situation. The original story stated that, quote, the AI system started realizing that while they did identify the threat, at times the human operator would tell it not to kill that threat, but the AI got points by killing that threat. So what did it do? It killed the operator. It killed the operator because that person was keeping it from accomplishing its objective, end quote. Let's hope that the walkback or the second version of the story by the Air Force colonel is true, because as it was originally told, it's exactly what AI researchers are warning about. And it's hard to hear this story and not think about, again, that paperclip maximizer. Our last headline this week is from the Washington Post. Quote, ChatGPT took their jobs. Now they walk dogs and fix air conditioners, end quote. So we have our first reported story of white-collar workers losing their livelihood to AI or ChatGPT. The story features two people. The first is Olivia Lipkin, a copywriter in San Francisco. The other is a freelance writer, Eric Fain, in Illinois. I should say that at first I wasn't going to include their names in this podcast, but I think it's necessary to use their names as it helps to attach, personhood to these stories. These are people, after all, whose lives have been upended by AI, which is what this podcast is really about. In that regard, I think they're pioneers, and they're the first of many people who will experience this reality. Olivia worked at a startup as a writer, but she began to see the writing on the wall when discussions about ChatGPT began to show up in internal communications. She was let go in April without explanation, but deduced that it was due to ChatGPT from conversations with various managers. She stated that whenever someone brought up ChatGPT, she felt insecure and anxious that it would replace her. I think we talked about this previously, how will such a large group of people already struggling with mental health deal with the threat of job loss at the hands of AI? The article goes on to say that, quote, experts say that even advanced AI doesn't match the writing skills of a human. It lacks personal voice and style, and it often churns out wrong, nonsensical, or biased answers. But for many companies, the cost cutting is worth a drop in quality, end quote. I think that sums up this podcast. My position has been that corporations won't hesitate to turn jobs over like copywriting to AI if it saves them money. If labor is your biggest expense, and it is, why wouldn't they? The article didn't say if Olivia had any safety nets, but she's planning to be a dog walker in the short term. Eric Fain, the freelance writer, was notified by his recurring clients that his services would no longer be needed. The clients told him that ChatGPT was far cheaper. Not only cheaper, but free. ChatGPT's version 3.5 is free to the public. So these companies aren't even having to pay to replace Eric. They're doing it for free. One of his 10 customers did return due to errors in ChatGPT's writing, but it's not nearly enough to sustain him and his family financially. And Eric has other plans. He's planning to go to school to learn the heating and air conditioning trade. His point of view is that why should he run to other white-collar work that will eventually be replaced by an advancing AI? Why not try to get out ahead of it as much as possible? It will take AI much longer to replace HVAC technicians and trades like it. And I say good for him. We talked about this last week, that the shortage of labor in the trades may resolve itself if AI starts to make white-collar workers redundant. It looks like Eric is leading the way in that regard. And in Eric's case, he says he has about 6 months of savings, and that's great to hear, but he's probably the exception to the rule. How many people have 6 months of savings to see them through a transition like that? I can't imagine many. As a country, we just eclipsed $1 trillion in credit card debt. Student loan repayments are about to be resumed, and this doesn't seem like a recipe for success. Even for Eric, it has to be anxiety-inducing to watch your savings dwindle down to nothing. For those with no safety net, it has to be far worse. I'm looking for hope here, but I'm struggling to find it. That's the news for this week. You can see how prevalent AI is becoming in day-to-day life. There were and are more stories that could be covered, but there's simply not enough time in the day to do so. When I first started this podcast, I anticipated highlighting 2 or 3 news stories for each show, but the pace at which AI is making its mark is staggering. As it infiltrates our world, program by program, industry by industry, I don't think they're going to slow down. All of these stories we've talked about today are linked in the show notes. You can find it right there in your podcast app and click on it and go right to it if you want to read them. So let's talk about blue-collar work and white-collar work. Now, I realize that talking about white-collar and blue-collar work covers almost the entirety of work or employment, so I'll speak generally. There will obviously be exceptions to what I say, but let's think about the rule and not the exceptions. I've said previously that white-collar work is the most susceptible form of work in the short term. I think that was obvious in our headlines this week. In the initial episode, I went through a list of white-collar jobs that ChatGPT thinks will be lost to AI technologies in the short term. That list largely aligns with what technologists and futurists have been outlining over the past few years. So again, let's think about copywriters, receptionists, telemarketers, data entry folks, insurance underwriters, accountants, and human resources. These are the types of jobs that will be hit in the short term. Think about white collar roles in which the role is non-customer facing and doesn't require much interfacing with other roles. If the role itself is made up of repeatable actions or isn't very dynamic, chances are the technology will exist to handle that work, if it doesn't already, in the next few years. If the technology doesn't outright replace these professions in the short term, it will still impact the field, as AI will increase efficiencies among employees, leading to the need for less employees. As AI has become more sophisticated, more white-collar jobs will begin to be impacted. Even in the short term, AI technologies like ChatGPT will be incorporated into most, if not all, white-collar work. As soon as corporations begin to see that the work of the AIs is cheaper and far surpasses human intellect and capability, it's a matter of time before workers are removed from the process. And for those of you who see yourselves as superior to AI, just wait a while. There's no job where intellect is required that AI won't be able to surpass your ability or speed. All right, we haven't talked about blue-collar work on this show at all, really, at this point, but we will today. Let's get into it. That's because it's less susceptible to AI at the moment. But you should know that investors are right now funding research into technologies that will displace a great many blue-collar workers. And we'll go through some examples. One example is John Deere, the major tractor company, plans to fully automate all of its farming equipment by 2030. So that's 6.5 years, not long at all. Of course, they might not meet that goal, but they are still pushing for automation. And there's obviously not a ton of folks working on commercial farms, as much of the industry is already mechanized. But for those folks who do work in commercial farming, this will have a real impact. It could, of course, free them up to do other things, but what other things? And if John Deere is making these efforts, companies like Caterpillar probably are doing so too. And that would mean bulldozer operators, backhoe operators, crane operators, material movement folks could all be susceptible to AI in the near term. And this will, of course, take years to reach, your local Bobby's Rock and Gravel in your hometown, but it will make it there. So from farming and earth moving, let's talk about transportation, which is a big one. When I first got interested in AI a decade or so ago, self-driving technology was what spurred that interest. Truck driving or transportation is the number one job in the U.S. for men without a college degree. I would have thought even back then that we would have seen faster implementation of self-driving trucks as the technology already exists. The problem is that the technology has to be perfect, and there is bureaucracy, I would say a bureaucracy problem in this country, so that has helped slow implementation of self-driving trucks. There are self-driving taxis already in use in some cities right now, so it's only a matter of time before this becomes reality for trucking. Of course, it will take years for the trucking industry to transition to self-driving trucks or to retrofit current trucks with that technology. But we talked several weeks ago about a story in which a truckers union in California was lobbying the state's government to slow down implementation and make guarantees that driverless trucks would have to have drivers in them to assist if needed. So the writing is on the wall. And a trade as big as trucking, not only will truckers be affected, but let's think about the downstream effects of driverless trucks. When the transition is complete, let's say by 2045, what will that mean for hotels, truck stops, truck stop cooks, truck stop waitresses? A driverless truck will not need to stop for the night to rest and have a shower and a meal. It may need to stop and recharge, but that's it. That's not to even mention the truck drivers themselves. Learn to code doesn't seem to be a viable option moving forward. Another example which will expedite automation of some blue-collar fields is the lack of workers today. Over the last few years, companies have struggled to hire for both white and blue-collar trades. In my own experience, finding and keeping entry-level blue-collar labor at my company has been a struggle over the past few years. We've seen some improvement over the last 6 months, but the shortage remains. And this shortage will only accelerate the inclusion of AI technologies where they can be implemented. You may have seen some of the stories floating around about, or even experienced personally, fast food restaurants implementing kiosks at the front of their stores so customers can order their food via touchscreen versus having to interface with a human that may call out sick or not show up for work at all or may get your order wrong. McDonald's recently announced a fully automated restaurant in Texas, and there are videos floating around the web of that restaurant. You can see that you do not see or interact with humans in the store. If I had to guess, though, there are probably folks still in the background performing the dexterous work required to prepare a meal. But even still, the writing is yet again on the wall. Locally, I've seen 2 different restaurants that have had to close for being unable to hire employees. One, a chain, has shut one location entirely until the shortage goes away. The other closed its facility 1 day a week, citing a labor shortage. Again, this labor shortage is only going to expedite efforts from technology companies and increase investments from restaurants or corporations in order to avoid shutting down. I think in the long term, automated fast food was coming anyway, but this labor shortage will bring it here sooner than it would have otherwise. Other blue-collar work I think that is susceptible in the short term is warehousing, or warehouses in general, is definitely in the crosshairs of AI. Amazon is in the warehouse business, and they've been working for years to automate those warehouses with autonomous robots. And when I see stories in the news about Amazon warehouse employees voting to unionize, I only think about how fast Amazon will kick those folks to the curb once the technology is effective enough to do without humans. There are some videos floating around on the web of an Amazon warehouse back in as early as 2019 or 2020 showing robots at a pilot warehouse handling the bulk of the work. Amazon cites a desire to limit injuries in their warehouses, but I think we know they want to limit people in those warehouses altogether. I'll include a link to an article with a video showing that technology as of 2022. But there are some trades that are safe for the foreseeable future. Plumbers, electricians, HVAC techs, roofers, mechanics, and those type of trades that require an extreme amount of dexterity will be around for decades, or at least as long as AGI is held off. As I've said before, if we ever reach a strong AGI, all bets are off. There are companies working on robots right now that can do limited tasks, and there's also 3D printing of houses happening right now, but it's still largely conceptual. So I think it's safe to say that these trades will be around for a while. I recently listened to an interview with Robert Plater. Plater is the CEO of Boston Dynamics. Boston Dynamics is the company putting out these dystopic-looking videos of robots performing various tasks. In that interview, he states that he even thinks that it will be a while before robots can take over blue-collar trades, as that would require a massive production or manufacturing of robots and the AI or autonomy needed to perform those types of jobs. He did say one thing that struck me. He did say that humanoid robots or human-like robots will largely be utilized at first to handle the dangerous jobs that humans have to do and don't want to do. I take issue with that because I know several people, especially as a younger man, who took on more dangerous jobs because of the better pay or hazard pay associated with that work. I can only assume the same is true today, and I think this is a place where tech folks are a bit out of sync with non-tech folks. In any case, if you haven't seen videos from Boston Dynamics, I'll include one in the show notes. One last note from Blue Collar Work. I remember reading a passage in Kai-Fu Lee's first book called AI Superpowers that struck me. It discusses drone technology and what drones will be able to accomplish in the future. It's hard. Everything we talk about is really abstract, and it's hard to wrap your head around exactly what the future will look like. I think this technology, if it reaches the point that we think it will, then this passage paints a vivid picture of what the future could look like. And it goes like this, quote, As autonomous technology becomes more agile and more intelligent, we will see some mind-bending and life-saving applications of the technology, particularly with drones. Swarms of autonomous drones will work together to paint the exterior of your house in just a few hours. Heat-resistant drone swarms will fight forest fires with hundreds of times the current efficiency of traditional fire crews. Other drones will perform search and rescue operations in the aftermath of hurricanes and earthquakes, bringing food and water to the stranded and teaming up with nearby drones to airlift people out. What made me think of that passage was the comment on robots performing dangerous jobs. I've had friends over the years who work and travel the country fighting wildfires, as it pays very well for folks who otherwise wouldn't be able to gain that type of income with their current or regular day jobs. In any case, I think we've reiterated that white-collar jobs are the most susceptible in the short term, along with some blue-collar jobs. We should all start wrapping our heads around the fact that we may be like Olivia and Eric from the story mentioned earlier, and we might all need to pivot in our 20s, 30s, 40s, or even 50s to something we never saw ourselves doing. Previously, I've talked about, and I think it'll be a big theme throughout the course of this podcast, as long as it goes, about finding meaning or identity in work and how ingrained that has been in the human experience from the beginning of time. Even if you don't find meaning in your work, it at the very least gives you purpose and a reason for getting up in the morning. I also mentioned previously about how once a year or so I'll get into a real funk trying to make sense of what I'm doing with my life. I very much enjoy the life my work affords me, but the work itself is not meaningful in any real way. I think this is probably the case for a ton of folks in white-collar jobs. And I'm sure whether you work white-collar jobs or blue-collar jobs, people have these thoughts. And I think that's totally normal. I mentioned this yearly mood to a friend of mine at work who's in his mid-50s, and he laughed it off, saying that he has those thoughts every day. And at first I laughed it off and thought it was funny, but then it occurred to me how sad it was as well. And you might say, well, why not do something more meaningful with your time? And that's easy to say, and it's harder to do, especially when you've got people depending on you. You know, once you acquire a family, a mortgage, and other consumer debt within a certain income range, just changing things up becomes that much more difficult. Also, being risk adverse doesn't help in that situation, because you can get super comfortable in one of these positions and eke it out for 40 years. And that's, the entirety of your life has been in this quiet struggle, trying to make it through to the end of the day to do what you want to do. So maybe AI, corrects that for us, and people aren't having to deal with that, to go work at this place for 8 hours a day and, keep looking at the clock until 5 o'clock, or keep waiting on Friday to get here so you can do what you want to do. So maybe you only have to do that for 2 or 3 days, as AI advances and you work less. Maybe we'll find a better balance. I hope so. In my late 20s, I was working a well-paid white-collar job Monday through Thursday. This particular company was ahead of its time with a 4-day work week. I very much enjoyed it, and I'm very much in favor of a 4-day work week. The extra day in your life is hugely beneficial. I don't think you know how beneficial it is until you lose it, and I lost it when I moved to a new company. And if the future of work is less work, maybe we'll see more work weeks that look like that in the near term. But in this particular situation, I didn't have any additional obligations on Friday, as I was single at the time, and it just so happened that I lived near one of my brothers who had a landscaping business. Now, he was and is typically a one man operation, but me having Fridays off available with no obligations, I was quickly enlisted to help. So during the work week, I was very much white collar, talking about KPIs and listening to people drone on about mission statements and core values, dying a quiet struggle of a death in meeting rooms. And I think if white collar people spoke plainly, they would say they largely feel this way as well. And I think Gen Zers don't have a problem telling you that as much as Gen Xers or millennials do. But I think most people are feeling that when they're sitting in those meeting rooms having those conversations. And I should say here that it may come across that I, don't like what I do. I do enjoy it, and I've gotten good at it. So I do find some value in it. And I think you can hold to this position that you're not necessarily all in on the corporate culture, but you could still very much be effective at your job. And so, I mean, I've had conversations with friends who talk about, you're either a live to work type of employee or a work to live. I'm very much a work to live type employee. I think you can be a work to live type employee and be very good at what you do. And I would say I am. I'm typically in the top quartile of performers wherever I work and have been and for most of my adult life. So I think as an employee, you can very much provide value for your company and perform well, and at the same time not subscribe to the corporate culture nonsense that comes with working in those type environments. So during the week, Monday through Thursday, that was the kind of life I was leading. But on Friday and some Saturdays, I was literally had my hands in the dirt digging ditches with a shovel and using my hands. I've mentioned previously that I grew up in a blue-collar family, so this way of life and style of work is very familiar to me. And I should say these were long summer days in a southern sun where temperatures regularly meet and exceed 100 degrees in summer, not to mention the humidity that comes along with it. The work is as hard as you might imagine it to be, and when you have to take extra shirts with you to work to change into because you've sweated through the shirts throughout the day, it's fair to say it's tough work. But as hot as it may have been, as hard as the work may have been, the blue-collar work on Friday and some Saturdays was far more gratifying than the white-collar work I was doing Monday through Thursday. I'm sure part of that gratification was simply working with or being around my brother, but there's something about physical labor that feels like this is what humans were meant for. I'm sure many, or maybe even most white-collar folks would disagree, especially those who have never been exposed to it. But having done both, it's clear that one's more rewarding than the other. And I've polled people from similar backgrounds, and they mostly say the same thing. Their white-collar work affords them a certain lifestyle, but working with their hands is much more satisfying. And if they could, somehow obtain the same income doing manual labor or working with their hands that they have at their corporate job, they would absolutely do so. It could be that, all this is antiquated thinking. I'm not certain. But if I could work outside and make what I do at my corporate job, I think I absolutely would. And I think based on conversations with peers over the years, they would too. So like we talked about before, most white-collar work is a relatively new invention. Is this the kind of work humans were made for? I don't think it is. My point here is that AI is going to make a large part of this work obsolete. And in that sense, maybe AI will free those of us sacrificing our souls for a better compensation package for something better. I'm not sure what the next phase of that will look like. And there's something to be said for evolution and human progression, but I think we may have gotten work wrong in some sense. Maybe AI will correct it. Let's hope so. So that's it for this week. Next time we'll talk about UBI, or Universal Basic Income, where that's at. It's still very much conceptual, but what will it take to get there? How many people will be displaced by AI before that becomes more of a talking point? That will be the focus of the next show. But in the meantime, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to be even more deliberate, you can share this episode via text or email to a friend or friends. I will say that I deplore the idea of self-promotion. I don't like the idea of it, so I'm probably in the wrong game for that, as self-promotion is huge to an endeavor like this. So whatever help you provide, I would definitely appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk next time.